I'm delighted to present our keynote speaker, Professor Sachs, as Yael mentioned. Jeffery Sachs is a university professor and director of the Center of Sustainability Development at Columbia University, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 until 2016. He is also president of the UN Sustainable Development Solution Network and commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development. He has been advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries Generals and currently serves as an SDG advocate under Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He spent over 20 years as a professor at Harvard University, where he received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees. He has authored numerous bestseller books. His most recent book that was published last year is The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. Professor Sachs was twice named as one of the Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and was ranked by The Economist among the top 3 most influential living economists. So we would love Professor Sachs to present, to give us his keynote. Okay, it's over. Thank you.
Greetings. Am I there? Good. Okay. Greetings. Nice to be with you, and thanks so much for inviting me to join this opening, as I understand it, of the Center for Sustainability at Hebrew University. I appreciate very much this new initiative. I hope that I can help in any way. This topic is a passion of mine, and with some experience at Columbia University during the last 20 years in leading a center on sustainability, first the Earth Institute, and now the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. I also, of course, am always thrilled to have any chance to be with the Hebrew University because my connections go back a long way. It's now 45 years since I first got involved with Hebrew University with Michael Bruno, and I spent many happy years at the Falk Institute at Hebrew University, writing my dissertation and my first book with Michael Bruno. So it's a great pleasure, special pleasure to be with you. I think the starting point for me is to define sustainability. I tend to fly under the banner of sustainable development rather than the term sustainability. Sustainable development generally connotes a broad vision of sustainability, whereas the term sustainability sometimes connotes a focus on environmental issues, whereas the term sustainable development in my usage connotes an integrated or holistic vision of social development that embraces the economic dimension of material progress, the social dimension of social inclusion and social justice, and the environmental dimension of environmental sustainability. And this is the term that I would like to use today, sustainable development, and to discuss the issue of sustainable development, also from the perspective or the issues facing Israel, though, of course, I'm sure your research agenda will be Israel and the world in an integrated vision. But I take sustainable development to mean a multi-objective or triple bottom line vision of society in which we make economic progress that brings all groups along and that faces and achieve solutions to the multiple pressing and increasingly serious challenges of global climate change, loss of biodiversity, hydrologic crises in many parts of the world, and massive pollution, including all sorts of pollution, air pollution, ocean pollution, soil pollution, and so forth. Now we can add zoonotic disease outbreaks with increasing frequency, because this is yet another manifestation of a very crowded planet that is not handling the human environment interface with much care. So the challenges of sustainable development are pervasive and they are global, and they inevitably, therefore, also engage issues of global cooperation, regional cooperation, because most issues of sustainable development, whether it is energy supplies or land use or hydrologic cycle, are inevitably at a regional or transboundary scale. And this is obviously true for every issue that Israel faces, whether it is energy supply and energy security, or habitation and biodiversity, or issues of water. The connections of Israel in its neighborhood are paramount issues. So sustainable development poses many holistic challenges and a very deep research agenda as well. And inevitably, from a university point of view, I would say two things. One, these issues cannot be solved by any part of society other than universities playing a leading role, because universities uniquely bring together the range of earth physical sciences like climatology, hydrology, agronomy, and so forth, engineering sciences, including public health, electrical engineering, and civil engineering, and others, the policy sciences, including economics, politics, and sociology, and the human sciences, including human behavior, anthropology, ethics, and so forth. So universities are uniquely poised to add depth and substance to the sustainable development agenda. But I would also say universities are not intrinsically organized for the sustainable development agenda. First of all, typically it is not a discipline. It's not recognized as a discipline with a department and a faculty, though I would argue, if you give me the time, that it should be a department. There should be a Department of Sustainable Development. There should be a Faculty of Sustainable Development. And at Columbia University, we created a PhD in sustainable development, several master's programs in sustainable development, and an undergraduate major in sustainable development. But it's not normal, and it's not easy at universities, because this is transboundary work, and faculties are not so good at transboundary work. Faculty gets hired for expertise within single disciplines. Journals typically are about single disciplines. Publishing is typically about deep dives in individual disciplines, and we don't talk to each other all that well at universities. So for me, it's been an adventure to lead a university-wide initiative for now almost 20 years, the Earth Institute and the Center for Sustainable Development, and to understand ways that we can talk to each other better despite our babble, our differences of language, our differences of vocabulary and concepts and focus. I wanted to talk about one specific version of sustainable development for a few minutes, and that is the Sustainable Development Goals. These, of course, are the 17 objectives adopted by all 193 member states of the United Nations in September 2015. And I regard the Sustainable Development Goals as a critical tool on a planetary scale to achieve sustainable development. Achieving sustainable development is not easy because a holistic set of goals is not easy, because vested interests are very powerful, because inequalities in society or environmental destruction have causes, have interests behind them, have motivations or forces that are driving these patterns. Now, solving the challenges, for example, climate change or biodiversity conservation, therefore requires a significant change of policy, but also almost inevitably a change of policy at the global level. There's no way to face climate change other than through a global agreement, of course, because where we emit the greenhouse gases is irrelevant from the point of view of human-induced climate change. The atmosphere uniformly mixes the greenhouse gases irrespective of where they come from, and therefore we have a perfect global scale public good or externality that needs to be addressed, and that requires a tremendous amount of international cooperation. So the fact that we have shared global goals, 17 sustainable development goals, is really important. It's not surprising that the goals are not honored with rigor. They are unenforceable. They, at best, involve peer pressure. They're something like the 10 Commandments, I would say, though there's 17 of them. It's 3.5 tablets, not 2 tablets. But they have the same social role as the 10 Commandments. They are do's and don'ts, but they don't have a lot of enforcement mechanism, at least earthly enforcement mechanism behind them. They are more normative, globally agreed concepts that are violated repeatedly every day in all parts of the world, and that still nonetheless can have a normative force and help direct public policy towards their fulfillment. So I wanted to share a screen and talk a few minutes about the Sustainable Development Goals from the Israeli point of view, if I could, and I'm going to try to share the screen. I hope that I'm allowed to do so. It seems that I am. Can you see the screen? Yes, I see that you can see the screen. So let me, again, talk about Israel and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to give the optimistic title, in the post-COVID period, hoping that we're getting to the post-COVID period. So the notable point of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals is that they span the 3 major pillars of sustainable development. Several of them are about economics, ending poverty, ending hunger, universal health coverage, SDG 3, quality education for all children, SDG 4, and so on. Several are about social inclusion, such as gender equality, SDG 5, reduced inequalities of income and wealth, SDG 10, and justice under law, SDG 16. And then several of these SDGs are about environment, mainly SDGs 7, which is about renewable energy, 6, clean water, accessible for all, and then 11 through 15, SDG 11 is sustainable cities. SDG 12 is circular economy or reduced pollution. SDG 13 is sustainable climate. SDG 14 is sustainable marine environments. And SDG 15 is sustainable biodiversity on land, terrestrial ecosystems. For all of these, there are specific targets, mainly for the year 2030. So these were 15-year objectives that were established. And there are 17 goals and roughly 10 targets per goal. So there are 169 individual targets. They are to apply to all 193 member states. This is not an easy assignment. And achieving these multiple goals, the economic, social, and environmental goals, is very tough work. Our governments not only ignore many of these objectives, but don't really know at a technical level the right policy mix, the right technological mix to achieve these goals. What is the best way to achieve climate safety is obviously an issue that continues to be in need of intensive research and intensive policy design. Even harder, probably, are the goals SDG 2, 14, and 15, zero hunger, and together with sustainability of marine ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. That's a combination because zero hunger, or the food system, I could say generally, is the #1 anthropogenic forcing sector in the economy. The forcing of land use change, deforestation, pollution, water use, loss of biodiversity, invasive species, methane and nitrous oxide emissions, all come mainly from the agriculture sector, with the energy sector #2 in the mix. So achieving a sustainable global food system together with a sustainable marine and terrestrial set of ecosystems is an unsolved intellectual challenge, as well as certainly an unsolved practical challenge. So this year we have several diplomatic events on the calendar that are of extremely high importance. There is a food system summit that will take place at the United Nations during the opening of the General Assembly in September. The idea of the Food System Summit is to redesign the global food value chains so that we are producing nutritious foods in a way that can end hunger, reduce losses and wastes, protect biodiversity, and give livelihoods to the world's farm communities. Not an easy challenge. The second big item on the diplomatic agenda is in October. It actually opens in October because it's been turned into an ongoing blended conference, but that is the conference of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it's the 15th meeting of the parties, the COP15, and it will open in Kunming, China. But because Kunming will be very restrictive attendance because of COVID, it will actually then take place over succeeding months, partly online. And then the third major diplomatic event under the SDGs is the meeting of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow, Scotland, in the first 2 weeks of November. That is the Paris Climate Agreement +5. Paris, remember, was signed in December 2015. The 5th anniversary meeting was supposed to be December 2015, but because of COVID, it was moved to November 2021. And We are therefore at COP26, and that's when the world's governments are supposed to agree on a strategy to decarbonize the world energy system by mid-century, because that's the standard that we need in order to keep warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius, at least with a 50% probability. We're in a mess because the warming is already far advanced. And in order to have even a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees C, we need to decarbonize the world energy system in just 29 years. Well, there are many lessons of COVID. I'm not going to go through this, but the lessons of COVID mainly are we don't cooperate very well and we don't take care of each other very well. We lose the social dimension and we lose the global cooperation needed. We're quite good at the technological side, quite bad at the social and the political side. Now, each year, the UN group that I lead, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, produces an annual report, the Sustainable Development Report. And this year, we just came out with the report a couple of weeks ago. And in this report, among other things, we rank every country in the world according to its progress or lack of progress regarding sustainable development, and specifically regarding the Sustainable Development Goals. And in this year's report, Israel comes out 38th of 165 countries, ranking Israel and the other 165 countries according to progress or lack of progress on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Incidentally, the countries at the front of the list, the highest rankings, Finland, Denmark, Norway, other Northern European countries are all at the top of the list. Israel's performance is mediocre, I would say. Not so good. Obviously, very strong in certain areas, in technology, in low absolute poverty, but not so strong in a number of areas. We create a dashboard for the 17 goals, and this is the dashboard for Israel. It's a streetlight dashboard, except we have 4 colors in our streetlight. We have red, beige, yellow, and green. And Israel is a mix of halfway or worse. There are several areas where Israel has really poor performance on key indicators of sustainable development. And you can see that we're a pretty tough grader, I have to say. So you get a red if on any of these targets you're falling behind. But Israel shows up as red in areas of nutrition, education, inequality, waste, climate, biodiversity, and so on. So let me just walk through some of those examples, some of the major SDG challenges or shortfalls in Israel. First, on nutrition, the problem is not hunger, but obesity. Israel has a relatively high obesity level, nothing like in the United States, by the way, where it's almost 40% adult obesity. But the bad habits of fast food have come to Israel as well, and Israel shows up as high adult obesity on SDG 2. On SDG 4, surprisingly, Israel's performance on standardized cross-national educational attainment are mediocre. In science and mathematics, Israel on average is less by far than the OECD average. That's SDG 4. Israel has very high, or not very high, but high income inequality. But of course, many structural divisions of Israeli society between Jews and Arabs, between different groups within the Jewish community, a lot of class differentiation. So the income inequality and other kinds of inequalities, wealth inequality, are quite high. Israel produced a lot of physical waste and therefore gets a red score from SDG 12. There isn't yet a kind of circular economy in the industrial ecology. When it comes to climate, Israel is a fossil fuel using country to a disappointing extent, I would say, given all the sunshine that Israel has. And of course, Israel has used solar heating of water in homes for decades, but not photovoltaics to anywhere the extent that it should be using solar power. And Israel is doubling down, of course, on Mediterranean natural gas and has high emissions, and as far as I can see, no strategy for decarbonization by mid-century. Israel scores low on marine protected environments and low on terrestrial protection of biodiversity. And Israel also gets a low score on official development assistance. As a high-income member of the OECD, Israel should be giving development aid. And the norm of development aid is 0.7% of GDP is what the target is supposed to be. And Israel is around 1/7 of that level. The aid program in Israel is very low, and this also means that Israel gets a low score on development aid. From a substantive policy and research perspective, I like to think of achieving these SDGs in the sense of societal transformations that would improve education and social protection, or health and well-being, or clean energy and industry, or sustainable food and land use, or smart cities and digital transformation. So Israel obviously has some great strengths in many of these areas and weaknesses in others. But when I think about the policy framework to achieve the SDGs, I tend to do my research and policy analytics along broad investment-led transformations in these 6 areas. And when I look at Israel's situation in this regard, I'll just quickly point out a few things. I was a little surprised to find out that Israel, for high school students, lags the OECD average in reading, mathematics, and science. Not my guess, but turned out to be the case. I don't know more than that. Actually, the meaning behind these scores exactly, but I do look at PISA, which is the OECD's standardized comparative data on high school education outcomes, as a strong indicator. And so this suggests to me one area of research and policy concern. This is a graph of the inequality, the Gini coefficient. Israel is moderately high on an OECD comparative basis. The highest inequalities are Costa Rica, Chile, Mexico. The United States and UK have higher inequality than Israel. But Israel's income inequality and its wealth inequality are higher than almost all of Europe. And this is obviously a well-known area of intensive research in Israel. And one can look at the sociological dimensions of this inequality the policy dimensions of the inequality, the ethnic dimensions of the inequality, but the inequality is relatively high, but not catastrophically high. I would say the US is approaching catastrophically high inequality levels. Of course, there's a mountain of research and sociological knowledge about inequalities between Jews and Arabs, between different origins of the Jewish communities and so forth. But I highlight this inequality issue as one of the pressing issues for achieving the SDGs. I always look at levels of budget financing as a critical component when it comes to inequality. On a worldwide basis, Israel raises and spends more of national income than countries on average, but relative to OECD countries, Israel has lower tax revenues and spending than most of Europe. And I would say that this is the major reason why Israel's inequality is higher, because there's less fiscal redistribution of resources in Israel than there is in most of Europe, and certainly far less than there is in Northern Europe. The United States raises and spends even a lower amount of tax revenue. The US is especially nasty to its poor people. This has a long tradition. Part of it is racial, part of it is ethnic, part of it is just nastiness of American society. But the result is even higher inequality in the US and even lower fiscal redistribution. Of course, another issue that I would raise is Israel's energy future. All eyes in Israel among policy leaders are on Mediterranean gas. This is quite disappointing for me because we should be decarbonizing the energy system. And I wish that Israel would spend at least as much time thinking about how to boost solar power or other kinds of zero carbon energy as how to develop new pipelines and new gas reserves in the Mediterranean. This is just a big, big problem because we need to be decarbonizing the energy system worldwide. Every country should be going to net zero emissions by mid-century. The International Energy Agency was very clear in its report a few weeks ago called the Net Zero by 2050 report of the IEA. Its bottom line message was one sentence: no more gas and oil projects. Of course, it's incredible what oil and gas does to politics. Politicians go mad with this stuff. And the Mediterranean Basin region is all about gas now when it should be all about sunshine, solar power, wind, renewable energy. I raise this because a primary research issue of a center on sustainability should be a net zero pathway for Israel and for the Eastern Mediterranean to achieve what the world needs to achieve, which is decarbonization by mid-century. Let me just end by saying that I'm very honored and pleased to lead a network now of about 1,500 universities around the world working on issues of sustainability or of sustainable development. This is the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I hope that we can have a strong connection with the Center for Sustainability at Hebrew University. It would be a great pleasure and honor and a great benefit for the whole global network. We're actually doing a lot of networking, a lot of connections of universities across the world, a lot of joint projects, a lot of work on the European Green Deal, which is Europe's instrument for achieving the SDGs, a lot of work on regional strategies for protecting biodiversity, protecting water resources, achieving renewable energy with the extended grids of solar and wind and other intermittent renewable energy sources. So I hope that we could have a strong engagement together within this global network. Let me pause there. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you. But from the point of view of our work at universities, I personally think there are few issues of greater significance than bringing faculty together from across the major disciplines to help steer a new direction for our nations, regions, and world, because we are way off track. Things are getting more and more dangerous, and we are going to need the clearest thinking possible in order to find the right way forward. Thanks very much for letting me be with you today.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, for your fascinating talk. And I was given the opportunity to ask one question, so I will do it. I would like to ask you about another dimension that I deem highly important. There is an ample evidence that underprivileged groups are among the most impacted by the climate crisis. I'm coming from a social, as Yael mentioned, I'm actually the dean of the School of Social Work, so it's clear that I will ask about it. And from a justice perspective, and I wonder how the risks caused by the climate change can be more equally distributed between rich and poor, black and white, immigrants and native. In other words, how can we incorporate more centrally the social justice perspective into sustainability and climate crisis policies?
Thank you very much. First, we will not be able to manage climate change unless we stop the human forcings of climate change. In other words, learning to live with climate change, in my view, is not possible. It's going to get worse fast unless we actually put a brake on the emissions that are forcing the climate change. So we have to think, first of all, in this decarbonization as absolutely central. And let me add, just for clarity, something like 70% of the greenhouse emissions are due to energy, and another 25 to 30% are due to land use in other ways: deforestation, methane emissions from agriculture, both from ruminant animals, from rice paddies, and nitrous oxide from fertilizer use. I think Johan Ruckstrom is going to speak after me. He knows more about all of this than I do, and because I learned it from him. So you'll hear, I think you'll hear from him soon, or maybe he was before me, I'm not sure. But anyway, it's great to see Johan on the screen. But all of this is to say, the first rule is we've got to stop the damage that we're doing, because we're all going to suffer. But you can take it as a given that the poor will suffer more from anything bad that happens, because the poor inherently are vulnerable. Our societies, as long as we can read human history, have the powerful grabbing what they need to protect themselves as best they can, while the poor are left vulnerable. So even if the poor seem to have some protection at a moment, when crisis hits in society, whether it's COVID-19 or whether it's climate change or water scarcity or any other kind of big crisis, the poor will be vulnerable. This is a starting point, I want to say. But I think it's also true that the rich are going to be overwhelmed by all of this as well, unless we get this under control. Now, let me turn to your question, which is the role of social work, because we need programs targeted to the poor in vital areas, whether it is on improving quality of education, whether it is access to healthcare and the knowledge of health-seeking behavior, whether it is decent nutrition, whether it is decent livelihoods. We need directed programs to the poor. And the most successful societies have these. And in the United States, we have very little of this. And the poor are left to fend for themselves. Of course, we have departments for social work in city governments, but they're underfunded. The poor schools are underfunded, and so on. In my experience, directed programs to remediate, to help ensure that families have support, to help address critical needs of poor people are essential. And our experience, I've been working in the poorest places in Africa for the last 20 years, is that various kinds of social work are indispensable. So one kind of social work that we have been developing for 20 years are community health workers, who are members of the community trained in social work to help people in the community connect with clinics, with hospitals, to help them understand health-seeking behavior and so on. And we have found the social returns to that kind of social work to be extraordinarily high. So after developing community health workers in the village context where we've been working, we have gone on to community education workers in the same way. And after working in African villages for 15 years with these community-based workers, we pushed the concept in New York City the same way, because in New York City, our poor communities often don't speak English. They have very, very poor institutional connections with the hospitals and with the clinics. They are not adherent to drug prescriptions because often they can't afford to fill their prescriptions and so on. And social workers are essential in helping to solve these problems. So let me just give 3 cheers for social work and say, please join this agenda in a deep way, because the connectivity between the poor, who are marginalized, institutionally weak, lacking access to justice, and the things that those communities need for their dignity and for their sustainable development, require that powerful input of social work.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And please, thank you, everybody. And I hope we can continue the discussion soon, but congratulations on your initiative.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.